On a quiet night, Keanu Reeves noticed a scruffy puppy guarding a garbage bin. Curious, he looked inside and found two fragile, barely alive puppies wrapped in a tattered blanket. From that moment, with the brave little dog Scout by his side, Keanu embarked on a journey that uncovered a dark world of animal cruelty, leading to a fight for justice and hope. It was a quiet night. The streets were empty, and Keanu Reeves was enjoying a peaceful walk. The air was cool, and the city lights flickered softly in the distance. As he turned a corner, something caught his eye, a small puppy sitting by a garbage bin. The puppy looked thin and dirty. Its ears were perked up, and its dark eyes stared at him. Keanu stopped and frowned. "Hey there, little one," he said softly, kneeling down. The puppy didn't move. It growled softly, not in anger, but as if to warn him. It wasn't scared. It looked like it was protecting something. Curious, Keanu gently opened the lid of the garbage bin. Inside, he froze. Wrapped in a torn blanket were two tiny puppies. They were barely moving. "Oh no," he whispered, carefully reaching in. The puppies were so small and weak that it broke his heart. The guard puppy whined softly, nudging his leg as if begging him to help. "It's okay," Keanu said, scooping up the puppies and wrapping them in his jacket. He glanced down at the guard puppy, who followed him closely, its tail wagging faintly. "We're getting you all some help," Keanu promised, hurrying toward the nearest street to fly a cab. Keanu rushed out onto the street, scanning for a cab. The guard puppy, Scout as he had started calling it, stayed close, its small paws pattering alongside him. Wrapped in his jacket, the two fragile puppies barely stirred. Finally, a cab pulled over. Keanu opened the door and slid in, holding the puppies carefully. "To the nearest vet clinic," he said quickly. The driver glanced at the bundle in his arms and the puppy by his feet. "They okay?" "Not yet," Keanu replied, his voice tight. The vet clinic was quiet when they arrived. A tired-looking vet met Keanu at the door, her face softening when she saw the puppies. "They're in bad shape," she said after a quick glance. "We'll do everything we can." Scout whined as the vet carried the two puppies into the back. Keanu knelt beside the little dog, running a hand over its scruffy fur. "You did good, Scout. You kept them safe," he said. Scout wagged its tail but didn't take its eyes off the door where the vet had disappeared. Minutes felt like hours as Keanu waited in the lobby with Scout at his feet. Finally, the vet returned. "They're malnourished and dehydrated," she said, removing her gloves. "But they're fighters. With proper care, they'll recover." Keanu let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "What do they need?" "Hydration, warmth, and a lot of monitoring," the vet explained. "We'll keep them overnight to stabilize them." Keanu nodded. "Do whatever it takes. I'll cover it." As the vet spoke, Scout padded over to the door leading to the treatment room and sat down, staring intently. It didn't bark or growl, just waited. "Is he one of theirs?" the vet asked. "Yeah," Keanu said. "He's the reason I found them. He didn't leave their side." The vet smiled. "He's a brave little guy." Keanu looked at Scout and nodded. "Braver than most people I know." The next morning, Keanu returned to the vet clinic. Scout perked up as soon as he walked in, wagging his tail and trotting over to greet him. "How are they?" Keanu asked the vet. "They're stable," she said with a smile. "Still weak, but they're responding well to treatment." Relieved, Keanu looked at the two tiny puppies resting in a warm enclosure. They were fragile, but their soft breaths and occasional twitch gave him hope. As Keanu leaned in to check on them, his eyes caught something on the tattered blanket they had been found in. There was faint writing near one corner, barely legible, but enough to make out part of an address. "What's this?" he muttered, holding it up to the light. The vet stepped closer. "Looks like someone tried to cover their tracks," she said, frowning. Keanu traced the faded ink with his thumb. It wasn't a full address, but it was enough to start a search. "Do you think these puppies were dumped?" Keanu asked. The vet nodded. "Unfortunately, it happens more often than you'd think. Breeders, backyard operations, they abandon animals when they're not profitable." Keanu's jaw tightened. These puppies didn't deserve that. Scout, who had been quietly lying at Keanu's feet, let out a soft whimper. He reached down to scratch the dog's ears. "Don't worry, buddy. We'll figure this out." Keanu left the clinic with Scout trotting beside him, his mind racing. The faint address felt like a lead, but it also raised questions. "Who did this to you?" Keanu said aloud, glancing down at Scout. The puppy looked up at him, tail wagging slightly, as if to say, "Let's find out." Keanu pulled out his phone and mapped the partial address. It wasn't far, a rundown neighborhood a few blocks from where he had found the garbage bin. "All right," he said. "Let's see where this takes us." Keanu and Scout arrived at the address from the faded blanket. It led them to a small, run-down house on a quiet street. The yard was overgrown, the paint on the walls cracked and peeling. Keanu scanned the area, his instincts kicking in. "This place has seen better days," he muttered. Scout sniffed the air, his tail stiff and his nose working overtime. As Keanu approached the front door, an elderly woman stepped out from the house next door. "Looking for someone?" she asked, her voice cautious. Keanu turned, offering a polite smile. "Not exactly. I found some abandoned puppies, and the blanket they were wrapped in had this address." The woman's expression softened. "Ah, that house. The tenant moved out a couple of weeks ago. They left in a hurry, middle of the night." Keanu frowned. "Do you know who lived here?" "Just some guide," she said, shaking her head. "Kept to himself. But I did hear barking sometimes. I thought he had a dog." Keanu exchanged a glance with Scout, who let out a soft growl, his eyes fixed on the empty house. Keanu walked up to the door, finding it slightly ajar. Inside, the house was bare, just a few empty boxes and scattered papers. Scout began sniffing around, his movements deliberate. "Find anything, buddy?" Keanu asked, following him. Scout stopped near a corner of the living room and barked. Keanu crouched down, finding a small plastic bag partially hidden under a pile of trash. Inside were traces of dog food and a torn piece of a leash. Keanu's jaw tightened. This isn't just someone who left in a rush. They left these dogs behind. After combing through the house, Keanu found no more useful clues. Frustrated, he stepped outside and leaned against the porch railing. Scout sat by his feet, his ears twitching as he scanned the street. The elderly neighbor approached again. "If you're looking for more, you might check the park down the block. That man used to take his dog there." Keanu nodded. "Thanks. I'll take a look." Keanu and Scout headed toward the park, the sense of urgency growing with every step. Whoever abandoned the puppies hadn't just been careless, they'd been deliberate. "Let's hope this leads us somewhere," Keanu said, glancing down at Scout. The puppy barked softly, his tail wagging slightly, as if urging him to keep going. "Let me know if this chapter maintains the suspense and builds momentum. Shall we move to Chapter 5? The park was quiet when Keanu and Scout arrived. The fading sunlight cast long shadows over the empty benches and paths. Scout sniffed the air, his tail wagging hesitantly as he began leading Keanu along the dirt trail. "All right, buddy," Keanu said. "Show me what you've got." Scout stopped abruptly near a trash can, his nose pressed to the ground. He let out a sharp bark, pawing at something partially buried in the dirt. Keanu crouched down, brushing away the loose soil. There, hidden under a layer of dirt and leaves, was an old crate. Inside were traces of dog food and a faded collar with no tag. Keanu picked up the collar, examining it closely. "Looks like this wasn't just a park visit," he muttered. "This might have been where they left supplies for the dogs." As Keanu and Scout continued their search, a figure emerged from the other side of the park. It was a man in a worn jacket, his hands stuffed in his pockets. He glanced at Keanu and Scout, his gaze lingering a little too long. "Evening," Keanu called out, keeping his tone casual. The man nodded but didn't respond. Instead, he turned and began walking away quickly. Scout let out a low growl, pulling on his leash as if wanting to follow the man. Keanu's instincts flared. "Come on, Scout," he said, quietly following the man at a distance. The man led them to the edge of the park, where he paused briefly to look over his shoulder. Keanu quickly ducked behind a tree, keeping Scout close. The man muttered something under his breath before disappearing down an alley. Keanu hesitated, glancing at Scout. "What do you think, buddy? Do we follow?" Scout barked once, wagging his tail with determination. Keanu sighed. "All right, let's see where this goes." As they entered the alley, Keanu noticed traces of dog food scattered along the ground, leading toward a back door with faint scratches near the bottom. Scout sniffed the door, barking softly. Keanu's jaw tightened. Whoever this man was, he knew something about the puppies, and it was time to find out. The alley was dimly lit, with shadows stretching across the cracked pavement. Scout sniffed around the door, his tail stiff and his body tense. Keanu tried the handle, but it was locked. "Looks like this is where the trail ends for now," Keanu muttered, glancing around. Scout barked softly, his nose pressed against the ground, sniffing the faint traces of dog food. Back at the vet clinic, Keanu explained the situation to Mia, the shelter worker who had been helping with the puppies. She listened intently, her expression growing serious. "That area has been flagged before," Mia said. "We've heard rumors of illegal breeding operations there, but nothing solid enough to act on." Keanu leaned forward. "What do we do next? I need to stop this." Mia hesitated, then nodded. "If this is tied to trafficking, we need evidence. I can help, but we have to be careful. These people can be dangerous." Scout stayed close to Keanu as they returned home, his ears twitching at every sound. That night, Keanu noticed Scout pacing near the door, letting out a low growl occasionally. "You're not letting this go, are you?" Keanu said, watching the pup. Scout stopped pacing and looked at him, his tail wagging slowly. Keanu crouched down, scratching behind Scout's ears. "Don't worry. We'll figure this out together." a personal stake. The next morning, Mia called with news. I did some digging, she said. There's been an increase in abandoned animals in the area where you found the puppies. And it's not just random. Someone's trying to cover their tracks. Keanu frowned. Why would they dump animals and run? What are they hiding? Mia hesitated. If it's a breeding operation, they're probably trying to cut their losses. Animals that aren't sellable, too sick, too weak, they get dumped like trash. Keanu's grip on the phone tightened. He glanced at Scout, who was lying at his feet, his watchful eyes fixed on him. We can't let this continue, he said firmly. Mia suggested visiting another known hotspot for illegal animal activity, a warehouse on the edge of town. It's risky, she said, but if we can get solid proof, we can involve the authorities. Keanu nodded. Let's do it. We'll take Scout. His instincts have been spot on so far. As they finalized their plan, Keanu looked at Scout and smiled. Ready for the next adventure, buddy? Scout barked, wagging his tail in agreement. Keanu and Mia arrived at the warehouse just as the sun began to set. The building was old, with rusted metal walls and broken windows, giving it an abandoned look, but the faint hum of activity from inside told them otherwise. Scout was alert, his ears perked and his nose sniffing the air. He tugged on his leash, pulling toward the entrance. You sure about this? Mia whispered. Keanu nodded. We need to see what's going on in there. Keanu found a narrow side path that led to a small window. He peered inside, his breath catching at what he saw. The large room was filled with cages, each one holding a dog. Most were puppies, their cries muffled by the hum of machinery. A few men moved between the cages, carrying bags of food and cleaning supplies. This isn't just a dumping ground, Keanu murmured. It's a full operation. Mia's face hardened. We need evidence, she said, pulling out her phone to record. As they filmed, the door to the warehouse creaked open. Keanu and Mia ducked behind a pile of crates, holding their breath. The same man from the park walked out, talking on his phone. We need to move these dogs by tomorrow, he said sharply. We got buyers waiting. Keanu clenched his fists. They're trafficking them, he whispered. Scout let out a low growl, his body tense. Keanu placed a hand on his head, whispering, Not yet, buddy. Stay quiet. When the man disappeared back inside, Mia turned to Keanu. We can't just leave them here, she said. I know, Keanu replied, but if we act now without backup, we'll blow our chance to stop this for good. Mia hesitated, then nodded. We need the authorities, but we have to act fast. If they move those dogs, we'll lose them. As they prepared to leave, Scout barked suddenly, his sharp cry echoing in the alley. The sound of footsteps came from inside the warehouse. Someone's coming, Mia hissed. Keanu grabbed Scout's leash, pulling him toward the side exit. They ducked behind a dumpster just as the door swung open. One of the men stepped out, looking around suspiciously. He muttered something before going back inside. Keanu exhaled, his heart pounding. That was close, he said. Back in the safety of Mia's car, they contacted the local authorities, sharing the footage they had recorded. This is enough to act on, the officer on the line said. We'll plan a raid tonight. Be ready. We may need you to point out where you found the evidence. Keanu looked at Scout, who was curled up in the backseat, still alert despite the chaos. We're not done yet, buddy, he said softly. The night was thick with tension as Keanu, Mia, and Scout waited near the warehouse. The police had set up quietly, their vehicles hidden a few blocks away. Keanu could see officers checking their equipment, their faces serious. Are you ready for this? Mia asked, her voice low. Keanu nodded. We can't let them get away with this. Scout sat beside him, his ears alert and his nose twitching. He seemed to sense the urgency of the moment. A soft signal crackled through the police radios. The raid was on. Officers moved swiftly, surrounding the building. Keanu and Mia stayed back with Scout, watching as the officers breached the warehouse doors. The sound of shouting and barking erupted from inside, followed by the clatter of metal and hurried footsteps. Keanu couldn't stay still. Come on, Scout, he said, moving closer to the action. Mia followed, her phone ready to document everything. As they entered the warehouse, the scale of the operation became clear. Rows of cages lined the walls, each holding frightened dogs. The air was thick with the smell of unclean conditions. Scout suddenly barked and pulled on his leash, leading Keanu toward a side room. Keanu followed, pushing the door open to reveal a hidden area with even more cages, and the man from the park frantically trying to gather documents and escape. You're not going anywhere, Keanu said firmly, blocking the doorway. The man hesitated, his eyes darting between Keanu and Scout. Scout growled low and steady, his body poised. The man dropped the papers and raised his hands. I don't want trouble, he said, stepping back. You've already caused enough, Keanu replied, his voice cold. The police entered moments later, cuffing the man and securing the evidence he had tried to take. Keanu felt a wave of relief as Scout wagged his tail, his eyes still fixed on the man. As the officers cleared the warehouse, Keanu and Mia helped open the cages. One by one, the dogs were carried out to safety. Scout stayed close, sniffing at each dog as if reassuring them it was safe now. "These dogs deserve so much better," Mia said, tears welling up in her eyes. Keanu nodded. "At least now they'll have a chance." As the last of the dogs were loaded into rescue vehicles, an officer approached Keanu. "Thanks to you, we'd shut down a major operation tonight. You and your dog did good." Keanu glanced at Scout, who was now sitting calmly at his feet. "He's the real hero," Keanu said, scratching behind Scout's ears. The morning after the raid, Keanu sat on his porch with Scout lying at his feet. The cool breeze carried a sense of relief, but his mind was still racing with the images of the warehouse and the frightened dogs. Mia pulled up in her car, stepping out with a smile. "Thought I'd check in," she said, holding 2 cups of coffee. Keanu accepted one with a nod. "Thanks. How are the dogs?" "They're all safe at the shelter," Mia said, sitting beside him. "The vet says most of them will recover. A few are in bad shape, but they're fighters." Keanu glanced down at Scout, who perked up at the mention of the other dogs. "Good. They deserve a real chance." Mia smiled. "And it's thanks to you and Scout. The officer said your lead was what made the raid possible." Keanu shrugged. "Scout did most of the work. I just followed his lead." Later that day, Keanu and Scout visited the shelter to check on the rescued dogs. The sight of the puppies running around in clean spaces brought a sense of peace Keanu hadn't felt in days. Scout sniffed at each of the dogs, wagging his tail as if reassuring them. One of the puppies, now healthier, playfully nipped at his ear. "He's a natural leader," Mia said, watching the interaction. Keanu smiled. "He's more than that. He's a hero." As they prepared to leave, the shelter staff thanked Keanu and Scout again. "This isn't just a win for these dogs," one of them said. "It's a reminder that we can make a difference." Keanu nodded, his eyes lingering on the dogs. "Let's make sure it's the start of something bigger." Scout barked softly, wagging his tail as if agreeing. The following week, Keanu brought Scout to the vet for a routine checkup. After everything the little dog had been through, Keanu wanted to make sure he was healthy and thriving. Dr. Collins greeted them warmly. "Ah, the famous Scout. I've heard all about your heroics," she said, scratching Scout behind his ears. Scout wagged his tail, clearly enjoying the attention. As Dr. Collins examined Scout, she paused. "Did you know he has a scar here?" she asked, pointing to a faint mark on Scout's side. Keanu frowned. "No, what's it from?" "It's old, likely from a wound or surgery," Dr. Collins explained. "And judging by his behavior and physique, I'd guess Scout was trained before he ended up on the streets." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "Trained? Like as a working dog?" Dr. Collins nodded. "It's possible. His instincts, his focus, they're not typical. He might have been a rescue dog or even part of a security team before something happened." Keanu looked down at Scout, who sat calmly beside him, his eyes sharp and alert. "You've been through more than I realized, haven't you, buddy?" he murmured. Scout looked up at him, his tail wagging softly. Dr. Collins smiled. "Whatever his past, he's found the right place now." Keanu nodded. "Yeah, he has." Later that night, Keanu sat on the porch with Scout curled up at his feet. He thought about everything they had been through, the rescue, the raid, and now this new piece of Scout's history. "You've always been a hero," Keanu said softly, running a hand over Scout's fur. "I just didn't know how much until now." Scout let out a contented huff, his tail thumping lightly against the wooden floor. A few days after the vet visit, Detective Harper called Keanu with an update. "We've been digging deeper into the operation," Harper said. "Turns out the raid barely scratched the surface." Keanu frowned, gripping the phone tighter. "What do you mean?" "This trafficking ring isn't just local," Harper explained. "They're part of a larger network. The warehouse was one of several hubs." Keanu glanced at Scout, who was lying nearby, his ears twitching as if he sensed something was up. "So it's not over yet?" "Not even close," Harper replied. Harper arranged a meeting with Keanu and Mia to share more details. At the station, they reviewed photos, maps, and notes from the investigation. "There's a pattern," Harper said, pointing to a map with several red dots marked. "Abandoned dogs and puppies keep showing up in the same areas. It's like they're dumping them to avoid being traced." Mia leaned in, her expression tense. "They're cutting their losses, getting rid of the ones they can't sell." Keanu's jaw tightened. "So they're leaving them to die." Harper nodded. "It's cruel, but it's their way of staying under the radar." As they talked, Scout wandered around the room, sniffing at the map and documents. He stopped at a photo of a location, letting out a soft bark. Mia chuckled. "Looks like he's got a lead." Keanu smiled but stayed focused. Scout's instincts have been right before. If there's another hub, we need to find it. Harper folded his arms. "We're already tracking a warehouse on the east side of town. It's our best lead so far. Back at home, Keanu sat with Mia, going over everything they'd learned. Scout lay nearby, watching them intently. We can't stop now, Mia said. If this network is as big as Harper says, they'll just keep moving animals until they're stopped completely. Keanu nodded. Then we go all the way. We'll help Harper take down the entire operation. Scout wagged his tail as if agreeing. That night, Keanu stared out at the city lights, Scout sitting beside him. This is bigger than I thought, he said quietly, but we'll finish what we started. Scout let out a low, approving bark, leaning against Keanu's leg. Let's get ready, buddy, Keanu said. The fight isn't over yet. The morning after the meeting, Keanu and Mia met Detective Harper near the suspected warehouse on the east side of town. The location was more remote than the last one, surrounded by empty lots and abandoned buildings. Harper unfolded a blueprint of the area. We believe this is their main hub, he said. If we hit this one, we can dismantle their entire operation. Keanu studied the blueprint, his focus sharp. What's the plan? Harper outlined the raid strategy, assigning specific roles to his team. Keanu and Mia were asked to assist in identifying signs of animal trafficking and pointing out key areas for the officers to secure. Scout stays with me, Keanu said firmly. His instincts could help us find hidden areas. Harper nodded. Just be careful. These people might not go down without a fight. While waiting for the raid to begin, Keanu walked Scout around the perimeter of the warehouse. Scout sniffed at the ground, pulling toward a small side entrance partially hidden by crates. What's there, buddy? Keanu murmured. Scout let out a soft growl, his nose pressed against the door. Keanu noted the location and relayed it to Harper. Good catch, Harper said. We'll make sure to cover that area. As night fell, the officers moved into position. The air was thick with tension as they breached the main entrance, shouts and barking filling the air. Keanu and Scout stayed close to Harper as they entered the building. The sight inside was overwhelming. Rows of cages stacked on top of each other, filled with terrified animals. They're here, Keanu said, his voice steady but filled with anger. As the officers began clearing the warehouse, Scout pulled Keanu toward a dark corner. His growl deepened as he pawed at the floor. Keanu crouched down and tapped the ground, hearing a hollow sound. There's something under here, he said. Harper called over a few officers, who pried open a hidden trapdoor. Below, they found more cages and evidence linking the operation to larger trafficking networks. Without Scout, we might have missed this, Harper said, impressed. In the chaos, one of the traffickers attempted to flee. Keanu spotted him near the back exit and cut him off, blocking the doorway. Going somewhere? Keanu said, his tone calm but firm. The man hesitated, then lunged forward. Before Keanu could react, Scout leaped, grabbing the man's arm and holding him down until officers arrived. Good boy, Keanu said, kneeling beside Scout as the officers cuffed the man. By the time the raid ended, dozens of animals had been rescued, and the key players in the trafficking ring were in custody. As the officers loaded the rescued dogs into vehicles, Harper approached Keanu. This operation is shut down for good. You and Scout made a real difference. Keanu looked at Scout, who was sitting proudly by his side. We couldn't have done it without him, he said with a smile.